When Evelyn Moore collapsed at the crossroads with her dying infant, she had one choice left: beg the stranger on horseback for mercy, or watch her daughter slip away under the merciless Wyoming sun. But Caleb Hartman wasn't just any stranger. He was a man the town had already destroyed once, and saving her would ruin him again. What happened next in that dust-choked intersection would change two broken lives forever, proving that sometimes the hardest roads lead home. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Evelyn and Caleb's story travels. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The sun had no mercy that day. It beat down on the Wyoming crossroads like a hammer on an anvil, turning the packed earth into something that shimmered and wavered, making the four dusty roads appear to stretch into infinity. Heat rose in visible waves, distorting the horizon until sky and ground became one bleached, colorless void. Not a tree, not a building, just four paths meeting in the middle of nowhere, each one promising nothing but more distance, more dust, more burning daylight. Evelyn Moore stood at the center of that intersection, swaying on legs that barely held her weight. Her arms cradled her infant daughter against her chest, the baby's small body limp and frighteningly still. The child's breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps, each one weaker than the last. Evelyn's own breath rattled in her throat, dry as corn husks. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her dress, once a respectable gray cotton, hung in dusty tatters. The shawl she'd wrapped around the baby was threadbare, more holes than fabric, offering no real protection from the relentless heat. Her boots were splitting at the seams, held together by stubbornness and the leather's last memory of what it had been. Each step left a dark spot in the dust, blood from blisters that had broken and reformed so many times she no longer felt them. 3 weeks. She had been walking for 3 weeks, town to town, door to door, face after face turning away, sometimes with pity, more often with disgust, always with judgment. "We don't help women like you. Did you think no one would notice? No ring, no husband, no shame? There's a workhouse 2 towns east. They take in fallen women. That's where you belong." Evelyn had stopped trying to explain after the first week. Her story didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. All anyone saw was an unmarried woman with a fatherless child, and that was enough for condemnation. She'd learned to read the closing of doors in people's eyes before their hands even touched the wood. So she walked. Away from the last town that rejected her. Away from the judgments and the whispers. Away from everything except the hope that maybe, somewhere ahead, there would be someone who would see her daughter's need before her mother's sin. But now, at this crossroads under the burning sun, even hope was dying. The baby hadn't nursed in 2 days. Evelyn's milk had dried up somewhere between the last town and this empty intersection, her body finally surrendering to thirst and exhaustion. The child's small face was flushed with fever, her tiny lips parted, her eyes closed. Each breath seemed like it might be the last. Evelyn looked down each of the 4 roads, trying to remember which one she'd come from, trying to decide which one to take. They all looked the same, endless, empty, unforgiving. Her vision blurred, the heat pressed down on her skull like a physical weight. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled, catching herself before she fell, tightening her grip on her daughter. "Not yet," she whispered, though she didn't know if she was talking to herself, to the baby, or to whatever cruel force had brought them to this moment. "Not yet. Please." Her voice cracked on the last word, barely audible even to her own ears. The sun climbed higher, the heat intensified. Evelyn's shadow shrank beneath her feet until it was nothing but a dark smudge in the dust. She tried to take a step forward, any direction, it didn't matter anymore, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her body had finally reached its limit. She sank to her knees in the middle of the crossroads, still holding her daughter close. This was it then. This was where their story ended. Not in a town, not among people, but here in this empty place where 4 roads met and went nowhere. At least they'd be together. At least her daughter wouldn't die alone in some workhouse where children were numbers and mothers were forgotten. Evelyn bent her head over the baby, pressing her cracked lips to the child's fevered forehead. A tear tracked down her cheek, leaving a clean line through the dust. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, little one. I tried so hard." The baby stirred weakly, a small whimper escaping her lips. That tiny sound, that fragile thread of life, made Evelyn lift her head one more time. She squinted against the glare, looking down the eastern road, the one that seemed to shimmer most intensely in the heat. And that's when she saw him. At first he was just a dark shape in the distance, wavering in the heat haze like a mirage. Evelyn blinked, certain her mind was playing tricks. But the shape grew larger, more solid. A rider. A man on horseback, moving toward the crossroads at a steady pace. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened, not hope exactly, but something close to it, a final chance. One more door that might not close in her face. She tried to stand, failed, tried again. Her legs shook violently, but she managed to rise to her feet, swaying like grass in a wind. She adjusted her grip on the baby, trying to make herself look less desperate, less defeated, though she knew it was impossible. The rider drew closer. Evelyn could make out details now. A tall man in a worn brown hat, broad shoulders, a dust-covered coat. He rode a bay gelding that moved with the easy rhythm of a horse that had covered many miles. As he approached the crossroads, he slowed, his gaze fixed on the woman and child standing in the middle of the intersection. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to call out, to beg, to throw herself at his mercy, but pride, foolish, stubborn pride, held her tongue. She'd begged before. She'd pleaded and explained and tried to make people understand. None of it had mattered. The rider stopped his horse about 10 feet away. For a long moment, he simply sat there, studying her with eyes she couldn't quite see beneath the shadow of his hat brim. The silence stretched out, broken only by the horse's breathing and the faint whisper of wind across the empty land. Then he spoke, his voice rough with dust and distance. "You lost, ma'am." The question was simple, practical, without judgment. But something about it, the directness, the lack of assumption, made Evelyn's carefully maintained composure crack. "No," she said, her voice barely more than a rasp. "No, I'm not lost." "Then what are you doing out here?" He shifted in his saddle, and sunlight caught the side of his face. She saw a hard jaw, weathered skin, eyes that had seen their share of trouble. "Nearest town is 8 miles back the way you came. Nothing ahead for 20 miles. "I know." Evelyn looked down at her daughter, then back at the stranger. "I walked away from the town behind me. I'm walking toward whatever's ahead." "In this heat? With a baby?" "Yes." "That's not walking, ma'am. That's dying slow." The bluntness should have stung, but Evelyn was beyond being hurt by truth. "Maybe," she admitted, "but dying slow out here is better than dying fast back there." The rider's jaw tightened. Something shifted in his expression, recognition, maybe, or understanding. He'd heard something in her words that went deeper than the surface meaning. "What's in the town behind you?" he asked quietly. "People." Evelyn's voice was flat, empty. "People with judgment and good Christian morals and locked doors." "And what's ahead of you?" "I don't know, but it can't be worse." The rider was silent for another long moment. His horse shifted weight, leather creaking. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call sharp and lonely. "You got any water?" he finally asked. "Ran out yesterday." "Food?" "Day before that." "Money?" Evelyn almost laughed, but the sound died in her throat. "If I had money, sir, I wouldn't be standing in the middle of nowhere with my child dying in my arms." The words came out harsher than she intended, but she was beyond softening truth with politeness. Her daughter's breathing had become even more shallow, each tiny breath a struggle. The rider dismounted in one smooth motion. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and walked toward her, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. Up close, Evelyn could see he was younger than his weathered appearance suggested. Maybe 35, maybe 40. Hard years, not many years. His eyes were gray, like storm clouds, and they held a weariness that matched her own. He held out the canteen. "Drink!" Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for it, but she stopped before taking it. "My daughter first. Please." Something in his expression softened. Just a fraction, but enough to notice. He nodded. "Can you hold her so her head's tilted back?" Evelyn adjusted the baby's position with practiced care, supporting the tiny head. The rider uncapped the canteen and carefully dripped water onto the child's parched lips. The baby's mouth moved reflexively, tongue catching the moisture. She swallowed weakly, once, twice, then whimpered. "That's good," the man said quietly. "That's real good. Shows she's still fighting." He gave the baby a few more drops, then straightened. "Now you." Evelyn wanted to refuse, to insist her daughter needed every drop, but her body betrayed her. The moment the canteen touched her lips, she drank desperately, water spilling down her chin, soaking into her dress. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever tasted. "Easy," the man said, pulling the canteen away. "Not too much at once, or you'll be sick." Evelyn nodded, gasping, water dripping from her chin. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet." He capped the canteen and studied her with those storm-gray eyes. "Where were you planning to go?" "Anywhere. Nowhere. It doesn't matter. It matters if you're going to die trying to get there." "Then I die. At least out here no one will whisper about it. No one will say I deserved it." The rider's jaw tightened again. "What makes you think they said that?" "Because they always do." Evelyn met his gaze steadily, past caring what he thought. "I'm an unwed mother with a fatherless child. In their eyes, that makes me worse than a horse thief. At least a horse thief shows initiative." She expected him to look away, to make excuses, to offer hollow platitudes about her situation. Instead, he held her gaze, and what she saw there wasn't pity or disgust. It was recognition, understanding born from experience, not imagination. "I know that look," he said quietly. "I've seen it in my own mirror." Before Evelyn could respond, he turned back to his horse. She thought he was leaving, thought this brief moment of kindness was over, thought she'd be alone again in this burning crossroads. But instead of mounting, he pulled a bundle from behind his saddle, cloth wrapped around something. He returned and handed it to her. "Dried beef and hardtack, not much, but it'll keep you going." Evelyn stared at the bundle, then at him. I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." "Why are you helping me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a moment, looking past her toward the empty horizon, his expression distant. "Because someone helped me once," he finally said. "When I needed it. When I didn't deserve it." He looked back at her. "And because your little girl didn't choose this. She deserves a chance." Evelyn felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, but opening. For 3 weeks, she'd been treated like a problem, a scandal, a cautionary tale. This stranger was the first person who'd acknowledged her daughter as a person who mattered. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, as if the question carried more weight than it should. Caleb Hartman. I'm Evelyn Moore. And this is..." She looked down at her daughter, at the tiny face that had caused so much judgment from others. "This is Grace." "Grace." Caleb nodded slowly. "Good name. Better than she's gotten so far, I'm guessing." "Much better." Caleb glanced at the sky, measuring the sun's position. "Storm's coming. Can see it building in the west. This heat always breaks hard. Flash thunderstorm, probably hail. You don't want to be caught out here when it hits." Evelyn followed his gaze and saw the dark line of clouds on the horizon. So far away they looked like a smudge of charcoal. "How long do I have?" 2 hours, maybe 3. "Then I need to keep moving, find shelter somewhere." "In what direction?" Evelyn looked at the 4 roads, at the emptiness stretching in every direction. "I don't know." "You got family anywhere? Friends? Anyone who'd take you in?" "No." "Then where exactly are you walking to?" The question she'd been avoiding for 3 weeks, stripped down to its brutal simplicity. Evelyn shifted Grace's weight, feeling the baby's shallow breathing against her chest. "Away," she said finally. "Just away." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. His hand moved to his horse's neck, stroking the animal's dusty coat. The silence stretched out, filled with heat and waiting. Then he said something that changed everything. "My ranch is 14 miles northeast. Got a house, barn, well water, storm shelter if the weather turns mean." He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. "You and the baby could stay there, temporarily, until you figure out what's next." Evelyn stared at him.
Why would you offer that? Because you need it. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I am, what... I don't need to know. Caleb's voice was firm, but not harsh. I can see you're at the end of your rope. I can see your baby needs help. That's enough. People will talk. If anyone finds out you've taken in someone like me, let them talk. I stopped listening to what people say about me a long time ago. There was bitterness in his voice, old and deep. Whatever had happened to Caleb Hartman, it had left scars that hadn't healed. Evelyn recognized that kind of hurt. She carried it herself. I can work, she said quickly. I can cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden. I just need somewhere safe until Grace is stronger, until I can... You can barely stand up, ma'am. You're in no condition to work, and I'm not asking you to. He pulled his hat off, wiped sweat from his forehead, settled the hat back on. I'm offering shelter. That's all.
No strings, no expectations, just a roof and a place to rest until you and your daughter are strong enough to decide what comes next. Evelyn wanted to cry, but she had no tears left. She wanted to thank him properly, but words seemed inadequate. All she could manage was a whispered, "Why?" Caleb looked at her with those gray eyes, and for just a moment she saw past the weathered exterior to the man underneath, someone who'd been broken and put himself back together in ways that didn't quite fit anymore. Because if someone had made me this offer 4 years ago, he said quietly, maybe I wouldn't have spent those years thinking I'd lost my chance at anything good. He mounted his horse and held out his hand. Can you ride? I think so. Good. Give me the baby. You climb up behind me. Storm's moving faster than I thought. Evelyn looked down at Grace, at the small face that depended on her for everything, then at this stranger offering salvation. Every instinct screamed that she shouldn't trust him, shouldn't put herself in the power of a man she'd known for 10 minutes. But those same instincts had left her dying in a crossroads with her daughter in her arms. Sometimes you had to choose between fear and faith. She handed Grace up to Caleb, who cradled the baby with surprising gentleness in the crook of his arm. Then Evelyn reached for his outstretched hand. His grip was strong and calloused, and when he pulled, she felt herself lifted from the dust, swinging up behind him on the horse. Her body screamed in protest, muscles pushed past exhaustion, bones aching, skin burning, but she wrapped her arms around Caleb's waist and held on. Her name's Grace, she said again, as if saying it would protect her daughter. I know, you told me. I remember. Caleb adjusted his hold on the baby, making sure she was secure against his chest. Hold tight, we're going to move quick. He urged the horse forward, away from the crossroads, along a path that wasn't quite a road, just a worn trace through the sage and buffalo grass. The horse moved at a steady trot, jarring but not violent, eating up the miles. Behind them, the dark line of clouds grew larger, spreading across the western sky like spilled ink. Thunder rumbled, distant but getting closer. The air took on a strange heaviness, pressure building like a held breath. Evelyn rested her cheek against Caleb's broad back, feeling the rhythm of the horse's gait, feeling Grace's small body secured between them. For the first time in 3 weeks, maybe for the first time in her entire life, she let someone else carry the weight. The sun beat down. The storm approached, and somewhere ahead, hidden in the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory, a ranch waited. Neither of them knew if this was salvation or just another kind of ending, but they rode toward it anyway, because there was nothing else left to do. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled. The flat, featureless crossroads gave way to rolling hills dotted with sage and rabbit brush. Occasional cottonwoods appeared in the low places where seasonal creeks ran, their leaves dusty and curled from the heat. The horse moved with the steady persistence of an animal that knew its way home, and Caleb rode with the loose-seated grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Evelyn's grip on his waist loosened slightly as exhaustion pulled at her. She forced herself to stay alert, to hold on, but her body wanted nothing more than to surrender to the swaying motion of the horse and let unconsciousness take her. Only the knowledge that Grace was cradled against Caleb's chest kept her focused. The baby hadn't made a sound since they'd started riding. That worried Evelyn more than crying would have. Silence meant weakness. Silence meant giving up. How far? she managed to ask, her voice rough. 6 miles, maybe less. Caleb's voice carried over his shoulder. You holding up? I'm here. That's not what I asked. Evelyn didn't answer. She concentrated on staying conscious, on maintaining her grip, on not slipping off the horse's broad back. Thunder rumbled again, closer now. The western sky had turned the color of old bruises, purple and gray, and an angry greenish tint that spoke of violence building. The air smelled different, metallic and sharp, like the taste of copper pennies. Storm's moving fast, Caleb said, more to himself than to Evelyn. Should have known. Heat like this always breaks hard. The horse picked up its pace without being urged, ears swiveling back toward the approaching storm. Animals knew. They could feel weather changes in their bones, in ways humans had forgotten. The first gust of wind hit them like a fist, sudden and strong, nearly pulling Evelyn's threadbare shawl from her shoulders. Dust devils spun up from the ground, whirling columns of dirt and debris that danced across the landscape. The temperature dropped noticeably, the oppressive heat giving way to a kind of charged coolness that prickled the skin. There! Caleb pointed toward a low structure barely visible in the distance. Line shack. Old one, but the roof's still good. We won't make the ranch before this hits. He guided the horse toward the building at a canter now, the animal's hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. Behind them, the storm wall advanced like a living thing, dark and roiling and full of fury. The line shack materialized from the landscape like something conjured. It was a rough structure of weathered gray wood, probably built decades ago when the first cattlemen claimed this territory. One small window, shuttered, a door hanging slightly crooked on leather hinges. But the roof looked intact, and the walls were still standing, and that was more than they had anywhere else. Caleb pulled the horse to a stop right at the door. Can you get down? Yes. Evelyn slid off the horse, her legs nearly buckling when they hit the ground. She caught herself against the animal's flank, breathing hard. Caleb dismounted with Grace still cradled carefully in his arm. He handed the baby to Evelyn, then kicked open the shack's door. It swung inward with a protesting creak. Get inside. I'll get the horse secured. Evelyn stumbled through the doorway into gloom. The interior was small, maybe 12 feet square, with a dirt floor, a crude fireplace, and a single wooden bunk built against the far wall. Spiderwebs draped the corners. The air smelled of dust and old wood and mouse droppings, but the walls were solid and the roof wasn't leaking. She sank onto the bunk, still clutching Grace, and watched through the open door as Caleb worked with practiced efficiency. He stripped the saddle and tack from the horse, carried everything inside, then led the animal around to the lee side of the shack where a small lean-to offered minimal shelter. By the time he stepped back through the door and pulled it shut behind him, the first raindrops were hitting the ground, fat and heavy, kicking up small explosions of dust. Within seconds, the rain intensified. What had been drops became sheets, water hammering down with the force of anger. Thunder cracked overhead, so close and loud that the walls shook. Lightning strobed through the cracks in the shuttered window. Caleb stood with his back against the closed door, breathing hard, water streaming from his hat. Made it. Barely. The storm raged outside like the world was ending. Wind screamed around the corners of the shack, finding every gap and crack, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth and electrical discharge. More lightning, more thunder, the two coming almost simultaneously now. The storm was directly overhead. Inside the small shelter, Caleb and Evelyn were strangers thrown together by necessity, separated by 6 feet of dirt floor and a lifetime of circumstances they didn't know about each other. Evelyn looked down at Grace. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, she could see her daughter's chest rising and falling, still shallow, still weak, but steady. The baby's eyes were closed, her small face relaxed. She's still breathing, Evelyn said softly, more to herself than to Caleb. She's tougher than she looks. Caleb hung his hat on a peg driven into the wall and ran his hand through wet hair. Kids usually are. He moved to the fireplace, kneeling to examine it. Someone had left a small stack of wood in the corner, dry mesquite, protected from weather and time. Caleb arranged kindling with the automatic precision of someone who'd built 1,000 fires, struck a match from a case in his pocket, and coaxed flame to life. Within minutes, orange light filled the shack, pushing back the gloom. Get closer to the fire, he said, standing and brushing his hands on his pants. You're both soaked and starting to shiver. Evelyn hadn't noticed she was cold. The shock of temperature change from baking heat to storm-driven coolness, combined with exhaustion and wet clothes, had sent her body into mild shock. She moved closer to the fireplace. Grace clutched against her chest and held out her hands to the growing warmth. Caleb retrieved his saddlebags and began unpacking supplies. More dried beef, hardtack, a small pot, coffee grounds wrapped in oilcloth. He moved with methodical purpose, setting up camp as if this was routine, as if sharing a line shack with a desperate stranger and her infant was just another day. When's the last time you ate something hot? He asked, not looking at her. I don't remember. Then you're due. He filled the pot with water from his canteen, set it near the fire to heat, and added coffee grounds. The smell that rose as the water warmed was like redemption, rich and dark, and speaking of comfort. Evelyn's stomach cramped with sudden, fierce hunger. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Rain pounded the roof. Wind rattled the shutters. But inside, the fire crackled, coffee brewed, and warmth slowly returned to frozen limbs. Caleb poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to Evelyn. Careful, it's hot. She took it with one hand, her other arm still wrapped around Grace, and sipped carefully. The coffee was strong and bitter and absolutely perfect. Heat spread through her chest, through her belly, all the way to her fingers and toes. She took another sip, then another, feeling life return to her exhausted body. Thank you, she said, meeting Caleb's eyes across the fire. For all of this. I know you didn't have to. Don't. His voice was gentle but firm. Don't thank me for doing what any decent person should do. You'd be surprised how few decent people there are. No. Caleb poured himself coffee and leaned back against the wall, cup cradled in both hands. No, I wouldn't be surprised at all. The fire popped and hissed. Rain drummed steadily on the roof. In that small shelter, while the storm raged and the world narrowed to flames and shadows, two damaged souls began the careful process of learning whether trust was still possible. Can I ask what happened? Caleb said after a long silence. How you ended up out here? Evelyn looked down at Grace, at the small face so innocent of the judgment that had nearly killed them both. Do you really want to know, or are you just making conversation? I want to know, but only if you want to tell me. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, weighing truth against self-preservation. But something about Caleb's steady presence, his lack of judgment, made her want to speak. I was a seamstress in Denver, she began slowly. Good at my work. I had regular clients, a reputation for quality. I was careful with my money, saving for my own shop someday. She paused, sipping coffee. There was a man, a banker, respected, married. Caleb's expression didn't change, he just listened. He paid attention to me, made me feel seen, important. I was young and stupid enough to believe his promises. Evelyn's voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion. When I realized I was carrying his child, he gave me money and told me to take care of it. When I refused, when I told him I wanted to keep the baby, he made sure every client I had dropped me, every door closed, every opportunity vanished. He ruined you. He made it clear what happened to women who didn't do what they were told. Evelyn shifted Grace's weight slightly. I tried to stay in Denver, tried to find work, but his influence reached everywhere. Eventually I had nothing left, so I walked. Where were you trying to get to? Anywhere he wasn't. Evelyn looked up at Caleb. I thought maybe in a smaller town, somewhere he had no connections, I could start over. But I didn't realize how far his kind of poison spreads. Everywhere I stopped, people saw an unmarried woman with a baby, and that was all they needed to know. So you kept walking, until I couldn't anymore. Until we ended up at that crossroads where you found us. She paused, where we would have died if you hadn't stopped. Caleb was quiet, staring into the fire. The light played across his weathered features, highlighting old scars, a thin line across his cheekbone, another along his jaw. Marks of violence survived. My wife died 4 years ago, he finally said. Her name was Sarah. She was sick, consumption, but the doctor in town refused to see her,
Said he couldn't risk his reputation treating a woman married to someone like me. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. What had you done? Stood up to the wrong people. The big ranchers who thought they owned everything. Land, water, law. I testified in court about their illegal fencing, their theft of cattle, their threats against smaller ranchers. He drained his coffee cup, set it down. The judge ruled against them, but that didn't matter. They made sure everyone in town knew I was trouble. Made sure doors closed. Made sure when Sarah got sick, no one would help. She died because they punished you. She died because I thought standing up for what's right was more important than protecting what I loved. Caleb's voice was rough with old pain. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. I held her while she drowned in her own lungs, and I couldn't do a damn thing except watch her suffer. Outside, thunder rolled, more distant now. The storm was moving past, its fury spent. After she died, I stopped caring what people thought, Caleb continued. I kept my ranch running, kept my head down, but I didn't pretend anymore. Didn't smile in town, didn't make nice with the people who killed my wife through their righteous cruelty. I existed, that's all. Until today. Until today. Caleb looked at Evelyn across the fire. When I saw you standing at that crossroads with your baby, I saw Sarah. I saw myself. I saw what happens when good people do nothing. So you helped me because of her. No. His voice was firm. I helped you because of you, because your daughter deserves a chance Sarah never got, because maybe if I can do this one thing right, it'll balance some small part of what I did wrong. Evelyn understood. They were both carrying ghosts, both trying to find redemption in a world that seemed determined to deny it. Grace stirred against Evelyn's chest, making a small sound, not quite a cry, but stronger than before. Evelyn looked down and saw her daughter's eyes flutter open, saw tiny fingers curl and uncurl. She's waking up, Evelyn whispered, hope cracking her voice. That's real good. Caleb stood and moved closer. The water and rest helped. She's fighting back. As if to prove him right, Grace's mouth moved, her small face scrunching up in the prelude to a proper cry. When it came, it was weak and reedy, but it was a cry, a declaration of life, of need, of stubborn refusal to surrender. Evelyn laughed through sudden tears, pressing her face against her daughter's forehead. Yes, little one. Yes, I'm here. We're safe. She opened her dress and guided Grace to her breast, hoping against hope that there would be something there. The baby latched on weakly, and Evelyn felt the pull, faint but real. Her body, given rest and water and safety, was starting to respond again. Caleb turned away, giving them privacy, and busied himself checking the fire, adjusting the coffee pot, looking anywhere except at the intimate moment of mother and child. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady patter. The thunder had moved east, grumbling its way toward the horizon. The worst had passed. Inside the line shack, in the warm glow of the fire, something else was beginning, fragile and uncertain, but real. The possibility that broken things could be mended. The hope that second chances existed, even for those who thought they'd used up all their chances. Grace nursed for several minutes before falling back into sleep, exhausted but fed, weak but alive. Evelyn wrapped her daughter in the threadbare shawl, then looked up to find Caleb watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said again, knowing the words were inadequate, but saying them anyway. "For seeing us, for stopping, for this." Caleb nodded slowly. "Storm's passing. We'll wait another hour for things to settle, then ride for the ranch. You'll have a real bed tonight, proper food, whatever you need to get your strength back. And after that? After that, we'll figure it out as we go." He poured himself more coffee. "No rush, no pressure, just take it one day at a time." One day at a time. It seemed like an impossible luxury, the idea of having days to spend rather than just hours of survival. Evelyn leaned back against the rough wall of the shack, Grace sleeping peacefully against her chest, and watched the fire burn. The wood popped and crackled, shadows danced across the walls. Outside, the rain fell soft and steady, washing the dust from the world. For the first time in months, maybe for the first time ever, Evelyn allowed herself to imagine tomorrow. Not as something to fear or survive, but as something that might hold possibility. It wasn't hope, not quite. Hope was too big, too bright, too likely to shatter. But it was something close. And for now, in this rough shelter with a stranger who'd shown more kindness than anyone in her life, that was enough. The storm passed completely as evening approached, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of rain-soaked sage. Caleb stood in the doorway of the lined shack, watching the clouds break apart, revealing strips of clear sky turning gold and pink with sunset. Behind him, Evelyn dozed on the bunk, Grace nestled against her, both of them finally surrendering to exhaustion. He'd let them rest another hour, he decided. Then they'd make the ride to the ranch in the cooler evening air. The horse was rested and fed. The storm had settled the dust, and the setting sun would guide them home. Home. Strange how that word still had power, even after everything. Caleb looked back at the woman and child sleeping in the firelight, and he made himself a promise. Silent, but binding. He would give them sanctuary. He would ask no questions and demand nothing in return. He would offer them the chance he'd denied Sarah through his pride and stubbornness. And maybe in doing so, he'd find some small measure of peace. The sun continued its descent, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of fire and gold. The land stretched out vast and endless, indifferent to human suffering, but also offering room for new beginnings to those brave enough or desperate enough to reach for them. In the lined shack, the fire burned low. Grace breathed steadily. Evelyn slept without dreaming. And Caleb Hartman stood watch, a guardian of possibilities neither he nor his unexpected guests could yet see. The crossroads where they'd met was far behind them now. The road ahead remained uncertain, but they were moving forward together, and sometimes that was the only direction that mattered. The sun had nearly touched the horizon when Caleb finally woke Evelyn, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his voice low so as not to startle her. "Time to go. We've got maybe an hour of good light left." Evelyn's eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them for a moment before memory returned. She sat up carefully, checking Grace first, always Grace first, and found her daughter still sleeping, her breathing stronger than it had been at the crossroads. The baby's cheeks had lost some of their fevered flush, and her small body felt cooler to the touch. "She's better," Evelyn whispered, wonder in her voice. Rest and water work miracles. Caleb moved to gather his scattered supplies, packing them back into the saddlebags with efficient movements. "But she needs more than what we can do in a line shack. Real food for you so your milk comes back proper. A clean place to sleep. Time to heal." Evelyn stood, swaying slightly, and Caleb was there immediately, his hand steadying her elbow. She noticed he didn't grab, didn't assume, just offered support and waited for her to take it. Such a small thing, but after weeks of being pushed, pulled, handled like property or problem, that courtesy meant everything. "I'm all right," she said, though they both knew it was only partly true. "Just stood up too fast." "We'll take it slow, no rush." Outside, the world had transformed. Where dust and heat had dominated just hours before, now everything gleamed with moisture. The sage smelled sharp and clean, released by the rain. Puddles reflected the crimson sky. The air had cooled to something bearable, almost pleasant, and a light breeze carried the promise of a comfortable night. Caleb's horse stood hip-shot under the lean-to, looking rested and ready. He saddled the animal with practiced hands while Evelyn stood holding Grace, watching the sky change colors. She'd seen hundreds of sunsets in her life, but this one felt different, like a threshold being crossed, like an ending and beginning happening simultaneously. "Ready?" Caleb asked, leading the horse around to where she stood. "As I'll ever be." He mounted first, then reached down for Grace. Evelyn handed her daughter up with only the slightest hesitation. She was learning to trust this man, though the lesson didn't come easily. Caleb settled the baby against his chest with the same careful competence he'd shown before, then offered his hand to Evelyn. She grasped it and pulled herself up behind him, finding her seat, wrapping her arms around his waist. The horse shifted under the combined weight, then moved forward at Caleb's quiet command. They left the line shack behind, that rough shelter that had protected them from the storm, and headed northeast into the gathering dusk. The ride was quieter than before. No desperate race against weather, no fear driving them forward. Just steady progress through a landscape softened by rain and sunset,
the horse's hooves making soft sounds in the wet earth. Caleb rode with the relaxed posture of someone on familiar ground, and Evelyn found herself relaxing too, her exhausted body surrendering to the rhythm of the horse's gait. "Tell me about your ranch," she said after they'd been riding for perhaps 20 minutes. "Not much to tell. 500 acres, mostly grazing land. Got about 200 head of cattle, give or take. House is small, just 3 rooms, but it's solid. Built it myself 8 years ago when Sarah and I first settled." "You run it alone?" "For the last 4 years, yes. Had help before that, a hand named Tom who worked for me and Sarah. But after she died, he moved on. Couldn't blame him. The work was hard and I wasn't good company." "And you've managed alone all this time?" "Manage is maybe too strong a word. I keep things going. The cattle don't die, the grass grows, the water flows. Beyond that," he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Evelyn understood what he wasn't saying. He'd been surviving, not living. Going through motions because stopping would mean acknowledging how much he'd lost. "It must be lonely," she said quietly. "Loneliness is easier than remembering what it felt like not to be lonely." Caleb's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "Or at least I used to think so." "Used to?" "Today made me question a lot of things I'd convinced myself were true." They rode on in comfortable silence after that, letting the evening settle around them. The sky deepened from crimson to purple to indigo, and the first stars began appearing. A 3/4 moon rose in the east, bright enough to cast shadows. The landscape transformed in the moonlight, becoming something mysterious and beautiful, all silver edges and dark shapes, familiar yet strange. Grace stirred against Caleb's chest, making small sounds but not quite waking. Evelyn felt her body respond to her daughter's movement, that deep primal connection between mother and child that transcended exhaustion and circumstance. "How much further?" she asked. "See that rise ahead, the one with the lone cottonwood on top? My land starts at the creek just beyond it. House is maybe a mile past that." Evelyn squinted into the moonlit distance and could just make out the tree Caleb mentioned, a dark shape against the lighter sky. So close now. A real bed, he'd promised, proper food, safety. She almost couldn't believe it was real. They crossed the creek, a narrow flow of water still running swift from the storm, and climbed the gentle rise beyond. At the top, Caleb reined in the horse and sat still for a moment, looking down into the shallow valley below. "There," he said simply. Evelyn looked past his shoulder and saw it, a small house squatting in the moonlight, surrounded by split-rail fencing. A barn stood off to one side, larger than the house, with a corral beside it. In the distance, she could see the dark shapes of cattle grazing. It was modest, rough around the edges, but it looked solid and real and permanent. It looked like home. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's falling apart," Caleb corrected, but there was warmth in his voice. "Fence needs mending, barn roof's got a weak spot, the porch steps are rotting, but the walls are straight and the well's deep and the land's good." He urged the horse forward again, down the slope toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Evelyn could see more details. A vegetable garden gone somewhat to seed near the house, a chicken coop, a small smokehouse. Signs of life, of someone making do, of survival carved out of harsh land through stubborn persistence. They reached the barn first. Caleb dismounted with Grace still cradled carefully against him, then helped Evelyn down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, muscles cramped from the long ride, and Caleb caught her with his free arm. "Easy, you're running on empty. I'm fine. You're stubborn." But he said it with something that might have been respect. "Come on, let's get you inside. I'll tend to the horse after." "You should tend to him first. He's the one who carried us all this way." Caleb looked at her for a moment, then smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his weathered face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Sarah used to say the same thing. Always the animals first, then us." He handed Grace to Evelyn. "All right, you go on to the house. Door's unlocked. No reason to lock it out here. I'll be along in 10 minutes. Evelyn crossed the yard to the house, her boots squelching slightly in the mud left by the storm. The porch steps creaked under her weight. Caleb hadn't been exaggerating about them rotting, but they held. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Moonlight through the windows provided enough illumination to see by. The main room was exactly what she'd expected from a man living alone. Functional, but sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, shelves holding tin plates and cups, a rocking chair near the cold fireplace. Everything was clean but worn, and there was a kind of resigned order to it, as if Caleb had stopped caring about comfort but still maintained the basic habits of civilization. A doorway led to what must be the bedroom. Evelyn walked through and found a bed with a simple frame, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher. The bed was made military tight, the floor swept clean. No pictures on the walls, no personal touches except for a woman's shawl hanging on a peg, faded blue wool carefully preserved. Sarah's shawl, still waiting after 4 years. Evelyn backed out of the bedroom, feeling like an intruder. She returned to the main room and sank into the rocking chair, Grace held against her chest. The chair creaked slightly as she moved, a comforting sound. Through the window, she could see Caleb in the barn, moving in and out of shadows as he unsaddled the horse, his motions practiced and sure. Grace stirred again, more insistently this time, and began to fuss. Evelyn opened her dress and guided her daughter to nurse, and this time her milk came easier, her body responding to rest and water and the absence of mortal fear. Grace latched on and fed with more strength than before, small sounds of satisfaction replacing the earlier weakness. "We made it," Evelyn whispered to her daughter. "We actually made it." The door opened and Caleb entered, carrying his saddlebags. He glanced at Evelyn and the nursing baby, then immediately looked away, moving to the far side of the room to give them privacy. "I'll get a fire going," he said, his back to them, "and heat some water. You could probably use a wash, and we'll need hot water for coffee and food. Please don't go to any trouble." "It's no trouble. It's what needs doing." He knelt by the fireplace and began building a fire with the same methodical precision he'd shown in the line shack. Within minutes, flames were licking up through kindling and catching on larger pieces of wood. Warmth began filling the room, pushing back the cool night air. Caleb hung a large pot of water on an iron hook over the fire, then turned to face Evelyn, his eyes carefully fixed on a point somewhere above her head. "The bedroom's yours. I'll sleep out here. There's sheets in the chest of drawers, clean ones. Sarah always kept extras, quilts too, if you need them." "I can't take your bed." "Yes, you can. You need proper rest, and that baby needs her mother healthy." His tone left no room for argument. "I've slept on worse than a floor. Won't hurt me none." Evelyn wanted to protest further, but exhaustion and pragmatism won over pride. "Thank you." "Stop thanking me." But his voice was gentle, not harsh. "You'll wear out the words if you keep using them." Grace had finished nursing and fallen back asleep, milk-drunk and peaceful. Evelyn stood carefully, her body protesting every movement, and carried her daughter into the bedroom. She laid Grace in the center of the bed, the safest spot, and surrounded her with rolled quilts to keep her from rolling off. Then she opened the chest of drawers and found the sheets Caleb had mentioned, along with several quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She made up one side of the bed for herself, leaving plenty of room for Grace, then returned to the main room. Caleb had set out food on the table, more of the dried beef, some hardtack, and a jar of what looked like preserved peaches. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Eat something before you fall over." Evelyn sat and ate mechanically at first, her body so depleted it had almost forgotten how to register hunger. But after the first few bites, appetite roared back. She ate the beef and hardtack, then the peaches, sweet and syrupy and absolutely perfect. Caleb watched her with quiet satisfaction, not eating much himself, just drinking coffee and making sure she had enough. "When did you last eat a full meal?" he asked. 6 days ago? Maybe 7. A farmer's wife gave me bread and milk before her husband came home and made her stop." "And before that?" "I worked for food when I could, washed dishes, scrubbed floors, whatever anyone would let me do for a meal. But most places, once they saw Grace—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Caleb's jaw tightened. "People can be cruel when they're afraid." Afraid of what? An unmarried mother? Afraid of being contaminated by someone else's bad luck. Afraid that charity toward the wrong person will mark them as fools. Afraid of complexity in a world where they want everything to be simple. Good people and bad people. Deserving and undeserving, righteous and fallen. You sound like you've thought about this a lot. 4 years of nothing but thinking will do that. He poured more coffee into her cup. People treated Sarah and me like we were contagious after I testified against the big ranchers, like standing up for what's right was a disease they might catch. Made me realize how much of what we call morality is just cowardice wearing a respectable coat. Evelyn sipped the coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. Do you regret it? Testifying? I regret that Sarah paid the price for my principles, but I don't regret standing up. If I'd stayed silent, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. Even though it cost you everything? It didn't cost me everything. It cost me Sarah. Caleb's voice went rough. And that's not the same thing, even though some days it feels like it. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the night deepening outside. Evelyn finished eating and pushed back from the table, her body so full and warm that unconsciousness was pulling at her like a tide. The water's hot, Caleb said, standing. I'll pour some in the basin in the bedroom so you can wash. Then you should sleep, really sleep, without worrying about where you'll be tomorrow or whether someone's going to chase you off. He filled the basin with hot water from the pot, carried it into the bedroom, then returned to the main room and pointedly turned his back, staring into the fire. Evelyn took the hint. She went into the bedroom and closed the door most of the way, leaving it open just enough that she could hear if Grace stirred. Then she stripped off her filthy, torn dress, the one she'd been wearing for 3 weeks, through dust and sun and rain and desperation. She stood in her thin chemise and washed with a cloth and the hot water, scrubbing away layers of dirt and sweat and fear. It wasn't a proper bath, but it was enough. She felt almost human again. She found a clean nightdress in the chest of drawers, Sarah's, obviously, but Caleb had told her to help herself. She pulled it on, the soft cotton enormous on her thin frame, and climbed into bed beside Grace. The mattress felt like heaven after weeks of sleeping on the ground or in ditches or not sleeping at all. Clean sheets, a real pillow, a roof overhead, and her daughter breathing peacefully beside her. Evelyn's eyes closed. She meant to stay awake, to think about what came next, to plan, to worry. But her body had other ideas. Within seconds, she was falling into sleep so deep it felt like drowning in dark, dreamless water. In the main room, Caleb sat in the rocking chair and stared into the fire. He could hear soft breathing from the bedroom, both the woman and the baby, both finally at peace. The house, which had been silent for 4 years except for his own footsteps, now held life again. He didn't know what he'd started today when he stopped at that crossroads. He didn't know if he was helping or just delaying the inevitable. He didn't know if Evelyn would stay a few days and move on, or if something more complicated was beginning. But he knew he couldn't have ridden past her, couldn't have left her and her baby to die in the heat because helping was inconvenient or risky or complicated. Sarah would have stopped. She would have helped without hesitation, without calculation, without fear of what others might say. Maybe that's what he'd been trying to do, honor her memory by acting as she would have acted. Or maybe he'd just been tired of being alone with his guilt. Caleb stood and spread his bedroll on the floor near the fire. He lay down, boots still on, hat within reach. Old habits from years of riding range and sleeping rough. He stared at the ceiling, at the play of firelight across the wooden beams, and listened to the night sounds. Wind in the eaves, distant cattle lowing, the pop and hiss of burning wood. Tomorrow would bring its own complications. The practical business of 2 people and a baby living under one roof. The question of how long and what came after, and what the town would say when word inevitably got out. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he'd done something right. He'd saved 2 lives that the world seemed determined to throw away. It was a start. The fire burned down to coals, the moon crossed the sky. In the bedroom, Grace slept in her mother's arms, both of them safe and warm, and for the first time in far too long, free from fear. Morning came soft and golden, sunlight filtering through the windows in long, dusty shafts. Evelyn woke slowly, confused at first by the comfort, the cleanliness, the absence of urgency. Then memory returned and she sat up carefully, checking Grace immediately. Her daughter was awake, eyes open and alert, looking around with the vague curiosity of an infant discovering the world. No fever, no labored breathing, just a baby being a baby, healthy and whole. "Good morning, little one," Evelyn whispered, running her finger along Grace's soft cheek. "Welcome back." Grace made a small sound, not quite a coo, but close, and Evelyn felt her heart crack open with love and relief so intense it hurt. She picked up her daughter and carried her into the main room. The fire was burning again, recently stoked by the look of it, and coffee was already made, but Caleb was nowhere to be seen. Evelyn poured herself coffee and stood at the window, looking out at the ranch in daylight. It was everything Caleb had said, rough, in need of repair, but functional and honest. The kind of place built by hard work and maintained through stubborn persistence. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, chickens pecked in the yard, and the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and green. The door opened and Caleb entered, carrying a bucket of fresh milk. He stopped when he saw Evelyn, seeming almost surprised to find her there, as if he'd half expected her to vanish during the night. "Morning," he said, setting the bucket on the table. "How'd you sleep?" "Like the dead," Evelyn smiled. "In the best possible way." "And the little one?" "Better, so much better. I think the worst is past." "Good." Caleb hung his hat on the peg by the door and moved to the stove. "I'm making eggs and biscuits. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling. I can help." "You can sit and rest. You've been running on empty for weeks. Let your body recover." Evelyn wanted to protest, to prove she wasn't useless, to earn her keep, but Caleb's logic was sound, and her body agreed enthusiastically with the idea of sitting down and doing nothing. She settled into the rocking chair, Grace in her lap, and watched Caleb work. He cooked with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Eggs cracked into a pan, biscuits shaped and placed in the oven, coffee kept hot. Within 20 minutes, he was setting plates on the table. "Come eat while it's hot." The food was simple but good, and Evelyn ate until she was uncomfortably full, her stomach protesting the abundance after weeks of near starvation. Grace nursed again, more strongly than before, and fell back asleep content. After breakfast, Caleb cleared the table while Evelyn washed dishes and water heated on the stove. It was such a normal domestic scene, man and woman working side by side in a kitchen, morning light streaming through windows, a baby sleeping nearby. As if they were a family, though they were nothing of the kind. "I need to ride out and check the herd," Caleb said, drying the last plate. "Make sure none of them got scattered by the storm. I'll be gone most of the day." Evelyn felt a sudden clutch of panic. "You're leaving?" "Just for the day. I'll be back before dark." He hung the dish towel on its hook and looked at her steadily. "You'll be safe here. No one comes out this far without reason, and I'm not expecting anyone. There's food in the pantry, water in the well. If you need anything, there's a rifle above the door, though I don't expect you'll need it." "I wasn't worried about safety, I just—" Evelyn trailed off, not sure how to explain the irrational fear that he'd leave and never come back, that this brief sanctuary would evaporate like a dream. Caleb's expression softened. "I'll be back. I promise. This is my home. I'm not abandoning it, or you." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm being foolish." "No. You're being someone who's learned not to trust good things." He picked up his hat and settled it on his head. "That's not foolish. That's survival. But I'm telling you straight, I'll be back before dark. You can count on it." He left, and Evelyn stood at the window watching him saddle a different horse, a rangy sorrel mare, and ride out toward the distant cattle. She watched until he disappeared over the rise, then turned back to the empty house. For the first time in weeks, she had a full day stretching ahead of her with no demands, no threats, no desperate walking toward an uncertain destination, just hours to fill however she chose. It felt strange, almost frightening in its openness. Grace woke and needed changing. Evelyn managed that with scraps of cloth she found in a basket, making do, improvising. Then she explored the house properly, getting a sense of the space that was, at least temporarily, her shelter. The pantry held more than she'd expected. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, preserved vegetables, jerky, salt, sugar. Enough to last through a hard winter, carefully stored and rationed. On one shelf, she found a box of women's things: needles, thread, buttons, scraps of fabric. Sarah's sewing supplies, untouched for 4 years. Evelyn's hands moved almost without thought. She took the box and her daughter and settled in the rocking chair. While Grace slept in her lap, Evelyn began sorting through the fabric scraps, her seamstress eye automatically assessing quality, size, possibility. By midday, she'd cut and sewn a proper diaper from soft cotton. By mid-afternoon, she'd made 3 more and started on a small gown for Grace. Nothing fancy, just practical clothing to replace the rags they'd been using. Her hands remembered the work, the rhythm, soothing. Needle in, pull through, neat small stitches that would hold and last. She'd been a good seamstress in Denver. She could be one again, somewhere, someday. The sun moved across the sky. Grace woke, nursed, slept again. Evelyn worked. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional sound of chickens outside. It was peaceful in a way she'd almost forgotten existed. She made dinner as evening approached, beans and cornbread, simple but filling. She was just pulling the cornbread from the oven when she heard hoofbeats outside. Her heart leaped irrationally, and she hurried to the window. Caleb was riding in, exactly as he'd promised, the mare moving at an easy walk. Evelyn felt relief wash over her so intensely she had to brace herself against the window frame. He'd come back. He'd kept his word. Maybe trust was possible after all. Caleb entered the house and stopped, looking around. The table was set, food waited. The room smelled of cornbread and coffee. Grace was clean and sleeping in a basket Evelyn had padded with soft cloth. And Evelyn stood by the stove, wearing Sarah's old nightdress and apron, her hair pulled back, looking almost like someone who belonged there. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. "I wanted to. I needed to." Evelyn met his eyes. "You gave us shelter. The least I can do is make myself useful. That's not why I brought you here." "I know, but it's who I am. I need to contribute, not just take." Caleb nodded slowly, understanding. Pride wasn't just for men. Everyone needed to feel they had value, that they weren't just charity cases being tolerated. They ate together as the sun set, talking quietly about small things. The cattle, the weather, the small repairs needed around the ranch. Normal conversation, easy and unforced, as if they'd known each other longer than a single day. After dinner, Evelyn washed dishes while Caleb tended to the evening chores. When he came back inside, she was standing by Grace's basket, looking down at her sleeping daughter with an expression of such fierce love and protectiveness that Caleb felt something shift in his chest. "She's going to be all right," Evelyn said softly, not looking up. "Really all right. Because of you. Because she's got a mother who wouldn't quit, who walked until she couldn't walk anymore rather than give up on her." Caleb moved closer. "That kind of love saves children, not strangers on horses." "Both," Evelyn said. "It took both." She finally looked up at him, and in the lamplight, Caleb saw tears on her cheeks. Not sad tears, but something else. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. Or just the release of tension held too long. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the food or the shelter, for seeing us as human, for treating us like we mattered." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He'd done what anyone should do, but apparently the world had taught her different. "You do matter," he said finally. "You and Grace both. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." They stood there in the quiet house, 2 broken people and 1 small child, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, it was far too soon and complicated for that, but recognition, understanding, the beginning of something that might, given time and care, become something worth keeping. Outside, full night had fallen. Stars filled the sky in their thousands, bright and cold and distant. The ranch settled into darkness, and inside, lamplight glowed warm through the windows. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new complications. But tonight, they had enough. Shelter, food, safety, rest, and the fragile, precious beginning of trust. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt almost dangerously normal. Evelyn woke each morning to the sound of Caleb stoking the fire, the smell of coffee filling the small house. She'd feed Grace, then help with breakfast, and they'd eat together in companionable silence broken only by occasional conversation. Caleb would head out to work the ranch, and Evelyn would spend her days caring for Grace, mending clothes, cooking, cleaning, Small tasks that felt like miracles after weeks of having nothing to do but survive. Grace grew stronger with each passing day. Her cheeks filled out, her eyes brightened, her small body grew more robust. She began staying awake for longer periods, studying the world with infant curiosity, making sounds that were almost coos. Watching her daughter thrive, Evelyn felt something in her own chest begin to heal. Not the wounds themselves, but the belief that wounds could never heal. A week passed, then two. The summer heat persisted but seemed less brutal within the shelter of the ranch. Evelyn learned the routines of the place. When to gather eggs, how to work the pump at the well, which boards on the porch to avoid because they were rotten. She learned Caleb's habits too. How he took his coffee black and strong. How he was quietest in the mornings and more talkative at night. How he sometimes stood at the window after dark, just staring out at nothing, lost in memories he never spoke about. She didn't push. He'd given her space to be broken and healing, and she returned the favor. They were careful with each other in those early weeks, maintaining a respectful distance even as they shared close quarters. Caleb slept on his bedroll in the main room every night, never once suggesting anything improper. Evelyn kept the bedroom door open so Grace's sounds could be heard, but closed enough for privacy. They moved around each other like dancers who'd learned the steps, close but never touching, aware but never presuming. It was the third week when things began to shift. Evelyn was outside hanging laundry, sheets and clothes she'd washed in the big tub, using soap Caleb had shown her how to make from lye and fat. Grace was sleeping in a basket under the shade of the porch, and the morning sun was warm, but not yet punishing. She was humming without realizing it, some half-remembered song from childhood, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her hand stilled on the wet sheet. Her heart began hammering against her ribs. Caleb was out checking fence lines in the far pasture. She was alone. 3 riders came over the rise. Men on good horses, dressed in town clothes rather than working gear. Even from a distance, she could read their purpose in the way they sat their saddles. They weren't here for anything friendly. Evelyn dropped the sheet back into the basket and hurried to Grace, scooping up her daughter and holding her close. She considered running inside, barring the door, but that would only delay the inevitable. Instead, she stood on the porch, chin up, Grace against her chest, and waited. The riders reined in their horses about 20 feet from the house. The man in the center was older, maybe 60, with a steel-gray beard and eyes that held the kind of certainty that came from never being questioned. The 2 flanking him were younger, harder, their hands resting casually near the guns at their belts. "Morning, ma'am," the older man said, his voice carrying false courtesy. "I'm looking for Caleb Hartman." "This his place?" "It is." Evelyn kept her voice steady. "But he's not here right now." "That's all right. Maybe you can help me." The man leaned forward in his saddle, studying her with open calculation. "I'm Thomas Garrett. I own the big ranch south of here, the Double G. These are 2 of my hands. We heard Hartman's got himself a woman and a baby living here now. Thought we'd ride over and see if it was true." "What business is it of yours who lives here?" "Well now, that depends." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "See, Hartman's had trouble in the past. Made some poor decisions, said some things he shouldn't have, lost his wife because of it. We in town, we've been watching to make sure he doesn't cause more problems. And then we hear he's taken in a strange woman with a baby, and no one seems to know where she came from or who she is. That raises questions." "I'm a guest. That's all you need to know." "Guest." Garrett tasted the word like it was sour. "That what you're calling it? Because from where I sit, it looks like Hartman's sheltering someone who might not want to be found. Maybe someone running from something. Maybe someone bringing trouble to our territory." "I'm not bringing trouble to anyone. I'm just a woman trying to care for my daughter." "And where's the father of that daughter?" One of the younger men spoke up, his voice sharp. "Because I don't see a ring on your finger, and I don't see a man claiming that baby. Which makes me wonder what kind of woman Hartman's let into his house." Evelyn felt heat rise in her face, part anger, part shame she hated herself for feeling. "What kind of woman I am is none of your concern." "It's everybody's concern when it affects the character of our community." Garrett shifted in his saddle. "See, we got standards here. We got respect for decency and proper behavior. And we don't take kindly to women of loose morals setting up house with our neighbors, especially neighbors who've already shown poor judgment. Then it's fortunate I don't need your approval to exist. The words came out sharper than Evelyn intended, and she saw all three men's expressions harden. She'd made a mistake. These weren't men who tolerated being challenged by women, especially women they'd already decided were beneath their notice. You got a sharp tongue for someone in your position, Garrett said, his false courtesy evaporating. Maybe you don't understand how things work here. Hartman's barely tolerated as it is. He brings in someone like you, it's just going to make things worse for him. People are already talking. Let them talk. Oh, they will, but talking leads to other things. Business arrangements that don't work out, credit that dries up, neighbors who stop being neighborly. A man can't run a ranch alone when the whole territory turns against him. The threat was clear, and Evelyn felt cold fear seep into her chest despite the warm morning. These men had power, the kind that came from money and land and connections. They could destroy Caleb without ever raising a fist, just by closing doors and spreading poison. What do you want? She asked quietly. What I want is for you to understand the situation. Garrett's voice went almost gentle, which made it worse. Hartman's a good man who made bad choices, cost him his wife, cost him his standing. He's barely hanging on as it is. You staying here, it's just going to finish what got started 4 years ago. He'll lose everything, his ranch, his livelihood, whatever's left of his reputation, all because he was fool enough to take in a woman who should have known better than to bring her troubles to a man who's already got more than he can carry. So you want me to leave? I'm saying you should think about what's best, for him, if not for yourself. Garrett gathered his reins. We'll be back in a few days to speak with Hartman directly. Give him a chance to do the right thing. But I'm telling you now, as a courtesy, if you care about him at all, you'll spare him the choice. Pack up and move on before we come back. Find some other place to land. Because if you stay, you'll destroy him. Garrett turned his horse, and the other two men followed suit. They rode out the way they'd come, 3 dark shapes against the bright morning, leaving Evelyn standing on the porch with her daughter in her arms and her heart in her throat. She stood there long after they'd disappeared, the sun climbing higher, the laundry forgotten. Grace fussed, and Evelyn automatically bounced her, soothing her, but her mind was racing. They were right. She'd known it from the beginning, but she'd let herself ignore it, let herself believe that maybe this one time things could be different. But nothing had changed. She was still an unmarried mother with a fatherless child. She was still scandal and judgment and trouble. And Caleb was still a man barely hanging on, one more blow away from losing everything. By staying, she was destroying the man who'd saved her life. When Caleb rode in that evening, tired and dusty from a day of hard work, he found dinner waiting as usual. But something was different. Evelyn was too quiet, too contained, moving through the evening routine without her usual ease. Grace was fussy, picking up on her mother's tension, and Evelyn's attempts to soothe her seemed mechanical rather than natural. You all right? Caleb asked as they sat down to eat. Fine. The word came too quickly. You're a terrible liar. Evelyn set down her fork and looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, her face was drawn, and he could see she'd been crying. Some men came by today, she said quietly. Thomas Garrett, and 2 of his hands. Caleb went very still. What did they want? To tell me I should leave. To explain that I'm going to ruin you if I stay. To make it clear that the town won't tolerate you sheltering someone like me. Someone like you. Caleb's voice was flat and hard. They mean a woman alone with a child. They mean a woman of loose morals who'll corrupt the territory with her presence. That's horse shit. Is it? Evelyn met his eyes. Because from where I'm sitting, they're right. You took me in, and now you're going to pay for it. They said people are already talking. Said they'll make sure your business suffers, your credit dries up, your neighbors turn their backs. They'll destroy you the same way they destroyed you before, and it'll be my fault. It won't be your fault. It'll be their choice. Does it matter whose choice it is if you lose everything? Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced to the window and stared out at the darkness, his jaw working. Evelyn watched him, memorizing the line of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She was already saying goodbye in her head. 4 years ago, I stood up for what was right, Caleb said finally, not turning around. I testified in court against men like Garrett, who thought they could do whatever they wanted because they had money and power. And I lost Sarah because of it. Because the town decided I was trouble, and they closed ranks against me, and when she got sick, no one would help. I know. After she died, I swore I'd never care again what people thought. I'd keep my head down, mind my own business, let the world be as ugly as it wanted without trying to fix it. He turned to face her. And then I found you and Grace dying at that crossroads, and I couldn't ride past. I couldn't be the kind of man who lets people suffer because helping is inconvenient. I'm not asking you to be that man. I'm saying you've already helped us more than you can know. You saved our lives. You gave us time to heal and rest. But now it's time for me to go before I cost you everything you have left. And where will you go? The question hung in the air between them. Evelyn had no answer because there was no good answer. She'd walk again, she supposed, find another town, another closed door, another rejection. Keep walking until something gave out. Her body, her luck, or her daughter's fragile health. I'll figure something out, she said, hearing how hollow the words sounded. No. Caleb's voice was firm. No, you won't figure something out. You'll die out there, you and Grace both, and it'll be because I was too much of a coward to tell Thomas Garrett and his kind to go to hell. This isn't about courage. It's about survival, your survival. What kind of survival is it if I have to become the kind of man who throws a woman and baby out to protect myself? Caleb moved back to the table, bracing his hands on the back of his chair. What kind of life is that? What kind of man does that make me? It makes you smart. It makes you someone who learns from his mistakes. My mistake wasn't standing up for what's right. My mistake was not fighting hard enough, not finding another way to protect Sarah while still doing what needed to be done. And I've spent 4 years telling myself I'd never make that mistake again, that I'd never let fear make me small. Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not making it hard, they are. Caleb's voice gentled. Evelyn, listen to me. If you leave because you want to, because you've got somewhere better to go, some plan that makes sense, I won't stop you. But if you're leaving because men like Garrett scared you, because you think you're saving me by sacrificing yourself and Grace, then I'm telling you to stop. You don't understand. They'll destroy you. They'll try. They might succeed. But at least I'll know I didn't destroy myself by being too afraid to do what's right. What's right isn't always what's possible. And what's possible isn't always what we should settle for. They stared at each other across the table, the argument circling back on itself, neither willing to concede. Grace began crying in earnest, and Evelyn picked her up, bouncing her automatically, but the baby wouldn't be soothed. She can feel the tension, Caleb said quietly. Kids always know. I know. Evelyn's voice broke. I know, and I hate that we're doing this to her. I hate that everywhere I go, I bring trouble. I hate that my daughter's life is going to be defined by my mistakes. Her life is going to be defined by how much her mother loves her and fights for her. Everything else is just noise. Pretty noise that can kill you just as dead as an actual bullet. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching Evelyn struggle to calm Grace, seeing the exhaustion and fear and desperate love warring in her face. Then he did something unexpected. He walked around the table and gently took Grace from her arms. Let me try, he said softly. He cradled the baby against his chest and began walking slowly around the room, humming something tuneless but soothing. Grace's cries gradually quieted, her small body relaxing into his arms. Evelyn watched, something in her chest cracking open at the sight of this hard, weathered man being so gentle with her daughter. When Sarah was pregnant, Caleb said quietly, still walking, still humming between words, we used to talk about what kind of parents we'd be, what we'd teach our kids, how we'd protect them, what kind of world we wanted to give them. And the one thing we always agreed on was that we'd teach them to stand up for what's right, even when it was hard, even when it cost them something. He stopped by the window, Grace now sleeping peacefully in his arms, and looked out at the dark ranch. If I had a daughter and she came to me years from now and told me she was giving up something important because people were going to judge her for it, because the easy path was to just surrender and move on, what would I tell her? He turned to face Evelyn. I'd tell her that the easy path usually leads nowhere good. I'd tell her that people worth having in your life won't ask you to choose between them and your principles. I'd tell her to fight. Even if fighting means losing? Especially then, because at least you lose knowing you didn't give up without trying. Evelyn sank into the rocking chair, her hands covering her face. She was so tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being strong when she felt like breaking. Tired of making impossible choices with no good options. I don't know what to do, she whispered through her fingers. Caleb moved to stand in front of her, still holding Grace. Then don't decide tonight. Wait until Garrett comes back. Hear what he has to say. Hear what I say to him. Then decide. But decide based on what you want, not what you're afraid of. What I want doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you safe, keeping this roof over our heads, keeping... What you want matters. Caleb's voice was firm. It matters to me. It matters to Grace. It should matter to you. Evelyn looked up at him through her tears, at this man who'd shown her more kindness and respect in 3 weeks than anyone had in years. She wanted to stay. She wanted it so desperately it hurt, wanted to keep waking up in this small house, keep sharing meals across this table, keep watching her daughter grow strong and healthy in this rough sanctuary. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have something good without it destroying the person who gave it to her. But wanting and having were two different things, and she'd learned long ago that her wants usually led to pain. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm terrified that if I stay, I'll destroy you, and I can't live with that. And I can't live with myself if I let fear make me send you away. Caleb looked down at Grace sleeping in his arms. This little girl deserves better than a world that punishes her mother for loving her. She deserves to grow up knowing that sometimes people do the right thing, even when it's hard. You're asking me to gamble with your life. I'm asking you to let me make my own choices about my own life. He moved closer, close enough that Evelyn could see the weariness in his eyes, the old pain, but also something new, determination born from too many years of regret. When Sarah died, I promised myself I'd never let fear control me again. I broke that promise for 4 years. I'm done breaking it. Caleb, wait until they come back. Please, just wait. Don't make any decisions until you've seen how this plays out. Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to pack up in the middle of the night and leave before she could cause more damage. But Grace was sleeping peacefully in Caleb's arms, and she herself was so exhausted from fear and crying that she couldn't think straight. All right, she finally said. I'll wait. But if staying here is going to destroy you, then let me be destroyed standing up rather than destroyed giving in. Caleb carefully transferred Grace back to Evelyn's arms. Now get some sleep. You look like you haven't slept properly in weeks. I haven't. Then tonight you will. I'll keep watch. If Garrett or anyone else comes around, I'll handle it. Evelyn carried Grace to the bedroom and settled her daughter in the basket that had become her bed. Then she lay down on top of the covers, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. In the main room, she could hear Caleb moving around quietly, banking the fire, checking the windows, standing guard. She didn't know how long she lay there before exhaustion finally pulled her under. But her last conscious thought was that no matter what happened next, no matter what choices had to be made, she'd been given something precious in these weeks. A glimpse of what life could be if the world were kinder, if people were better, if safety and belonging were possible for women like her. She'd carry that glimpse with her, whether she stayed or left. And maybe that would have to be enough. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended tension. Evelyn went through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, caring for Grace, but everything felt fragile, temporary, as if the world could shatter at any moment. Caleb worked the ranch as usual, but he was never far from the house, always within earshot, always watching the horizon. They spoke little during those days. What was there to say? The decision had been made to wait, and now they were trapped in waiting, unable to move forward or back, caught in the moment before impact. On the 4th day, the riders returned. Evelyn saw them coming from the window where she stood washing dishes. The same 3 men, Garrett and his 2 hands, riding at a steady pace toward the house. This time, Caleb was there, working on the porch steps he'd been meaning to fix. He set down his hammer when he saw them approach, straightened to his full height, and waited. Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, Grace in her arms. If this was going to be the confrontation that decided everything, she wouldn't hide from it. The riders reined in their horses. Garrett looked at Caleb, then at Evelyn, then back at Caleb. Something like disappointment crossed his face. "She's still here," he said, as if this explained everything. "I hoped you'd have more sense." "She's here because I asked her to be," Caleb replied, his voice level. "This is my ranch, Garrett. My business, not yours. Your business becomes my business when it affects the reputation of this territory." Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. "I came here 4 days ago and spoke plain to your woman about what her staying would cost you. I'm guessing she told you what I said." "She told me." "And you're still fool enough to keep her here?" "I'm man enough to make my own choices about who's welcome in my house." Caleb's hands hung loose at his sides, but there was steel in his posture. "What happens on my land is my concern, not yours." "That's where you're wrong. What happens on your land affects all of us. We've got families in this territory, Hartman. We've got children. We've got standards of decency we expect people to uphold. And we don't tolerate men harboring women of questionable character." "There's nothing questionable about Evelyn's character." Caleb's voice went cold. "She's a woman who needed help, and I helped her. That's all." "That's all?" One of the younger men laughed. "You've got an unmarried woman living in your house, sleeping under your roof, and you want us to believe nothing improper's going on?" "I don't care what you believe. I know the truth." "The truth is you're a fool." Garrett's voice hardened. "I tried to do this easy, Hartman. Tried to give you a way out that wouldn't cost you everything, but you're too stubborn or too stupid to take it. So let me lay it out clear. If she's still here tomorrow, every business in town stops dealing with you. The bank calls in your loans. The feed store cuts off your credit. The cattle buyers find other sellers. You'll be finished inside a month." "Then I'll be finished." The words dropped like stones in the quiet morning. Evelyn felt her breath catch, felt her grip on Grace tighten. Caleb was choosing her, choosing principle over survival, choosing to stand rather than bend. "You're willing to lose your ranch?" Garrett's voice held disbelief. "Your livelihood? Everything you've built?" "I'm willing to do what's right instead of what's easy." Caleb took a step forward. "You want to destroy me? Go ahead. But you'll have to do it while I'm looking you in the eye, knowing that you're the kind of man who punishes people for showing kindness, knowing that your righteousness is just cruelty wearing a respectable coat, knowing that when you look in the mirror, you see someone who hurt a woman and child to protect his own comfort. Don't you dare preach morality to me. I'm not preaching. I'm stating facts." Caleb's voice was quiet but carried like iron. "You want me to throw Evelyn and her baby out to die because you're afraid of what people might think. You're willing to destroy my life to protect your idea of propriety. That's not morality. That's cowardice." Garrett's face flushed red. The two younger men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Evelyn felt fear spike through her, but Caleb didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a man who'd already made peace with whatever came next. "You've got until noon tomorrow," Garrett said, his voice shaking with rage. "Either she's gone or you are. Your choice." He yanked his horse's head around and rode off, his men following. They disappeared over the rise in a cloud of dust and fury, leaving Caleb and Evelyn standing on the porch in the sudden silence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Evelyn walked down the steps and stood beside Caleb, Grace heavy in her arms. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "I had to. You're going to lose everything." "Maybe, but I won't lose who I am." Caleb looked at her, and his eyes held a kind of peace she hadn't expected. "I've already lost everything once by being too afraid to stand up when it mattered. I won't make that mistake again." Evelyn felt something break inside her chest, not breaking apart, but breaking open. This man who barely knew her, who owed her nothing, had just risked everything to defend her, not because he loved her or wanted something from her, but simply because it was right. "I should go," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. "Do you want to go?" The question she'd been avoiding, the truth she'd been hiding even from herself. "No," she whispered. "No, I don't want to go. I want to stay. I want Grace to grow up here. I want to keep waking up in that small bedroom and having coffee with you in the morning and hanging laundry in the sun. I want all of it, desperately, and I hate myself for wanting it when it's going to cost you so much." "Then stay," Caleb said simply. "Stay and let me figure out how to deal with Garrett and his threats. Stay and let Grace grow strong. Stay and give us all a chance to build something worth keeping. But no buts, just yes or no. Do you want to stay?" Evelyn looked at him, at this weathered, damaged man who'd somehow found the courage she thought she'd lost. She looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully despite the confrontation that had just happened, and she thought about all the roads she'd walked, all the doors that had closed, all the judgments and rejections and cruelties. And then she thought about the possibility, fragile but real, that maybe this time could be different. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff. "Yes, I want to stay." Caleb nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his face. Then it settled. "We'll face whatever comes together." "Together," Evelyn repeated, testing the word, finding it strange and beautiful and terrifying all at once. They stood there on the porch as the sun climbed higher, two people who'd been broken by the world and were now choosing to stand together against it, not knowing if they'd survive, not knowing if it was wise, knowing only that sometimes the only path forward was the one that led toward each other. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together, and that would have to be enough. The rest of that day passed in a kind of heightened awareness, every moment sharp-edged and vivid. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about Garrett's deadline. Noon tomorrow, and what would happen when it passed with her still standing on Caleb's land. She tried to occupy herself with normal tasks, but her hands shook as she kneaded bread dough, and she jumped at every sound from outside. Caleb spent the afternoon checking his accounts, going through papers he kept in a wooden box under his bed, making calculations with a stub of pencil on scraps of paper. Evelyn watched him work and saw the lines deepen around his eyes, saw the tension in his shoulders. He was counting what he stood to lose, measuring it against what he'd chosen to protect. "How bad is it?" she asked as evening approached. Caleb looked up from the papers scattered across the table. "Bad enough. Garrett wasn't lying about the loans. The bank holds paper on half this ranch. If they call it in, I've got maybe 2 weeks before they start foreclosure proceedings. And the rest? Credit at the feed store keeps me supplied through winter. Lose that, and I'll have to pay cash I don't have. The cattle buyers are the worst of it, though. I need to sell my herd this fall to make it through winter. If they blacklist me, I'll have to drive the cattle 300 miles to find a market, and even then, word might travel ahead." "So you'll lose everything?" "Probably." He gathered the papers and returned them to the box. "But not definitely. There's always a way if you're willing to work hard enough and think creative enough." "That's not much of a plan." "No," Caleb admitted, "but it's what I've got." They ate dinner in near silence, both of them picking at their food, neither with much appetite. Grace was fussy again, picking up on the tension, and Evelyn spent most of the meal walking her back and forth, bouncing her, trying to soothe away fears that had no words. After dinner, as darkness settled over the ranch, Caleb stood at the window staring out at nothing. Evelyn sat in the rocking chair with Grace finally asleep against her chest, and the silence between them felt like something alive and waiting. "I'm going into town tomorrow morning," Caleb said finally. "Early, before Garrett's deadline. I want to talk to the banker myself, see if there's any wiggle room. Talk to some of the other ranchers, the ones who aren't in Garrett's pocket. See if I've got any allies left. And if you don't, then I don't, but I'm not going down without at least trying to fight back." Evelyn shifted Grace's weight slightly. "What do you want me to do?" "Stay here. Keep the doors locked. There's a rifle above the door frame and a shotgun in the bedroom closet."
"You know how to use them?" "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Rabbits, mostly, but I know which end the bullet comes out of." Caleb turned from the window, and in the lamplight, she saw him almost smile. "Good. I don't think Garrett will send anyone out here while I'm gone, but I want you prepared just in case." "How long will you be gone?" "All day, probably. I'll leave before dawn and be back before dark." He paused. "If something goes wrong, if I don't come back, there's money in the box with the papers. Not much, but enough to get you and Grace to the next territory. Take it and go." "Don't talk like that. I'm being practical." "You're being fatalistic." Evelyn stood, careful not to wake Grace. You're going to go into town, you're going to fight for your ranch, and you're going to come back. That's what's going to happen. You sound awfully certain for someone who was ready to leave 3 days ago.
3 days ago, I was trying to save you from my mistakes. Now I'm trying to believe you're strong enough to survive them. She looked at him across the small room. Don't make me a liar, Caleb Hartman. I'll do my best. They stood there looking at each other, and something passed between them, not spoken, not defined, but real, nonetheless. A recognition that they'd become tangled together, their fates bound up in ways neither had intended. What had started as simple charity had become something more complicated, more dangerous, more precious. Get some sleep, Caleb said quietly. Tomorrow's going to be a long day for both of us. Evelyn carried Grace to the bedroom and settled her daughter in the basket, then lay down on the bed fully clothed. She didn't expect to sleep, thought she'd lie awake all night listening to Caleb move around the main room, but exhaustion pulled her under faster than she anticipated. Her dreams were fragmented and anxious, walking endless roads, doors slamming in her face, Grace crying in the distance but always just out of reach. She woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of Caleb moving quietly through the house. She got up and went to the doorway, watching him prepare for town. He'd changed into his better shirt, the one without patches, and was settling his hat on his head with careful precision. "Be careful," she said from the doorway. Caleb turned, seeming unsurprised that she was awake. "Always am." "I mean it. Garrett and his men, they're not just going to let you walk into town and undermine them. They'll be watching." "I know." He picked up his gun belt from the peg by the door, strapped it on, checked the revolver with practiced efficiency. "But I can't fight them from out here. I have to meet this head on." Evelyn wanted to tell him not to go, wanted to say they should just pack up and leave in the night, start over somewhere else. But she'd already tried that argument, and Caleb had made his choice. All she could do now was respect it. "Come back to us," she said, and the words hung in the air with all their unintended weight. Caleb's hand stilled on the door handle. He looked at her for a long moment, and Evelyn saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Not quite love. It was too soon for that, but the beginning of something that could become love, given time and care. "I will," he promised. "That's a debt I intend to keep." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Evelyn heard his horse's hooves in the yard, the sound fading as he rode toward town. She stood at the window watching until she couldn't see him anymore, then returned to bed and lay awake until dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The day dragged. Every hour felt like 3. Every sound made her jump, every moment stretched taut with waiting. Grace seemed to sense her mother's anxiety and was cranky all morning, refusing to settle, fussing at every small discomfort. Evelyn walked her, bounced her, sang to her, but nothing seemed to help for more than a few minutes at a time. By noon, Garrett's deadline, Evelyn was standing at the window with Grace in her arms, half expecting to see riders coming over the rise. But the horizon stayed empty. No one came. The ranch sat quiet under the summer sun, and the only sounds were the chickens in the yard and the distant lowing of cattle. She tried to eat lunch, but couldn't manage more than a few bites. The bread she'd made yesterday tasted like sawdust. The water from the well, usually so cool and sweet, seemed to stick in her throat. She kept returning to the window, watching, waiting, her imagination conjuring 100 different disasters. What if Garrett and his men cornered Caleb in town? What if the banker had already started foreclosure? What if the other ranchers refused to help, turned their backs, left Caleb alone against forces too powerful to fight? What if he didn't come back? The afternoon crawled by. Grace finally fell asleep around 2 o'clock, exhausted from her own fussiness. Evelyn laid her in the basket and forced herself to do something productive. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, mended a torn shirt, reorganized the pantry. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon and Caleb still hadn't returned, fear settled into Evelyn's chest like a cold stone. He should be back by now. He'd said before dark, and the sun was already touching the tops of the distant hills. Something was wrong. Something had happened. She checked the rifle above the door, made sure it was loaded, then did the same with the shotgun in the bedroom. She told herself she was being paranoid, that Caleb had probably just gotten delayed. that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why he wasn't back yet. But her hands shook as she checked the weapons. The sun dropped lower. Shadows lengthened across the yard. Evening birds began their songs. Still no Caleb. Evelyn stood at the window with the rifle in her hands, Grace awake now and starting to fuss again, and watched the road with growing desperation. "Come on," she thought. "Come on, please. Just come home." Darkness was maybe an hour away when she finally saw movement on the horizon. A single rider, moving slowly, something wrong with the way he sat his horse. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the rifle and went to the door, stepping out onto the porch. The rider drew closer, and she recognized Caleb's horse, but Caleb himself was slumped in the saddle, one hand clutching the pommel, the other hanging loose at his side. Even from a distance, she could see something dark staining his shirt. Blood. Evelyn ran. She left the rifle on the porch, left Grace crying in the house, and ran toward the approaching rider. The horse stopped when she reached it, exhausted and blowing hard, and Caleb looked down at her with eyes glazed with pain. "Made it back," he said, his voice rough. "Told you I would." Then he slid sideways out of the saddle, and Evelyn barely caught him before he hit the ground. He was heavy, dead weight in her arms, and she couldn't hold him up. They went down together in the dust, Caleb's blood soaking into her dress, his breath coming in short, pained gasps. "What happened?" Evelyn's voice was high and scared. "Caleb, what happened?" "Garrett's men, after I left the bank, 3 of them in an alley." He tried to push himself up, failed, sagged back against her. "Got one good shot off before they got me. Right side. Bullet went through, I think." Evelyn looked at the wound, high on his right side just below the ribs. Blood was still flowing, though not as fast as it could have been. Through and through, like he'd said. That was good, but he'd lost a lot of blood during the ride home, and his face was pale, his lips bloodless. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Don't know. Maybe. Try. I need to get you inside." With her help, Caleb managed to get to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, his arm around her shoulders, and together they stumbled toward the house. Grace's cries grew louder as they approached, and Evelyn felt torn between her daughter's need and the man bleeding against her side. They made it through the door, and Caleb collapsed onto the bed in the main room, the one he never used, the one that had been Sarah's. Evelyn ran to check on Grace, still crying but unharmed, then rushed back to Caleb. "I need to stop the bleeding," she said, her mind racing through everything she'd ever learned about treating wounds. "Need clean cloth, hot water, whiskey if you've got it. Under the sink, bottle of rye." Caleb's eyes were starting to close. "Evelyn, listen. Don't talk. Save your strength." "No, listen." He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "If I don't make it, you're going to make it. If I don't, there's a paper in the box. Will. Leaves everything to Sarah's sister back east. But there's a note too, says you and Grace can stay until spring. Gives you time to figure things out. Make sure you find it. Stop talking like you're dying." "I might be." "You're not." Evelyn's voice was fierce. "You're not dying because I won't let you. You came back for me, and I'm going to make sure that wasn't for nothing." She found the whiskey and poured it liberally over the wound. Caleb arched and cried out, his hand fisting in the blanket. Then she packed the wound with clean cloth, binding it tight to slow the bleeding. Her hands were steady despite her fear, moving with the precision of someone who'd helped birth calves and doctored sick animals and knew that panic didn't help anyone. Grace's cries had subsided to whimpers. Evelyn checked on her again. The baby had cried herself to exhaustion and was falling asleep, then returned to Caleb. His eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow, but steady. "Caleb?" She touched his face, feeling the coldness of his skin. "Stay with me. Don't you dare leave." His eyes opened slightly. "Bossy," he murmured. "Yes, I am, and you're going to do what I say, which is stay alive." She pulled a quilt over him, trying to warm him, trying to will strength back into his body. "What happened in town? Did you see the banker?" "Yeah." Caleb's words came slowly, each one an effort. "Said he'd hold the loans for now. Said Garrett had been by making demands, but he didn't appreciate being told how to run his business. Small victory. That's good. That's something. Other ranchers, too. Some of them remembered what Garrett did to me and Sarah.
Said they'd buy my cattle if the big buyers wouldn't. Won't get top price, but it's enough to survive. So you won. You stood up to them and won. Maybe. Garrett didn't see it that way. That's why his men were waiting. Caleb's eyes closed again. Sorry, Evelyn. Sorry I couldn't make it back without... Shh. You made it back. That's what matters. But he was unconscious now, his body surrendering to blood loss and exhaustion. Evelyn sat beside him, one hand on his chest feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing, the other holding the cloth tight against his wound. Grace slept in her basket. The house was silent except for Caleb's labored breathing and the ticking of the clock. Evelyn kept vigil through the night. She changed the dressing when blood soaked through, forced water between Caleb's lips when he stirred enough to swallow, monitored his breathing and his color. Twice his breathing grew so shallow she thought she'd lost him, but both times he rallied, pulling back from whatever edge he'd approached. As dawn broke pink and gold across the Wyoming sky, Caleb's eyes finally opened and stayed open. He looked at Evelyn, who was still sitting beside him, her dress stained with his blood, her face drawn with exhaustion. "You look terrible," he said, his voice weak but clear. Evelyn laughed, a sound caught between relief and hysteria. "You got shot and nearly bled to death, but I'm the one who looks terrible?" "I'm being honest. You're being impossible." She touched his forehead, checking for fever, and found his skin cooler, more normal. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot." "That's accurate, at least." She helped him drink more water, supporting his head. "You're going to be all right. The wound's clean, the bleeding stopped. You just need rest and time to heal." Caleb caught her hand. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first. I was just returning the favor. We're even then." "Not even close." Evelyn squeezed his hand. "You risked everything for me and Grace. All I did was stop some bleeding." "You did more than that." His eyes held hers. "You stayed. When it would have been easier to run, you stayed. You took care of me when you could have taken that money and disappeared. You chose to be here." "Where else would I be?" The question hung in the air between them, and Evelyn realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't rhetorical. She'd spent weeks walking away from everything, running from judgment and fear and the world's cruelty. But last night, when Caleb came home wounded and bleeding, she hadn't even thought about leaving. She'd fought for his life with the same fierce determination she fought for Grace's, because somewhere along the way, this rough ranch and this damaged man had become home. "Nowhere else," she said quietly. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." Caleb's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Then stay. Not just until spring. Stay and help me rebuild this place. Stay and let Grace grow up here. Stay and..." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Stay and give us both a chance at something better than survival." Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. "You're delirious from blood loss." "I'm thinking clearer than I have in 4 years." Caleb tried to sit up, winced, and settled back down. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but I also know that in 3 weeks, you've brought more life back to this house than I've felt since Sarah died. And I know that when I was riding back here last night, bleeding and thinking I might not make it, all I could think about was getting home to you and Grace. Not the ranch, not my land, you. Caleb, I'm not asking you to marry me or make promises you're not ready for. I'm just asking you to stay. To give this a real chance instead of planning your exit. To build something together instead of always preparing to lose it." Evelyn looked at him. At this man who'd defended her to powerful enemies, who'd risked his life for principles most people only talked about, who was lying wounded in bed and still thinking about her future instead of his own pain. She thought about the crossroads where they'd met, about the storm that had sheltered them, about the slow building of trust that had brought them to this moment. She thought about Grace sleeping peacefully in the next room, healthy and strong because this man had stopped when he could have ridden past. She thought about all the closed doors and cruel judgments and endless walking, and then she thought about morning coffee and shared meals and the quiet comfort of not being alone. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like stepping into light after too long in darkness. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll stay, and we'll build something together. I'll stay and give us both a chance." Caleb's eyes closed, but he was smiling. "Good, that's good. But you have to promise me something." "What?"
Don't get shot again. I don't think my heart can take another night like that. I'll do my best." He opened his eyes and looked at her with warmth that made her breath catch. "Thank you, Evelyn, for saving my life, for staying, for all of it. Thank me when you're back on your feet and we've actually managed to make this work. I'll thank you now and then." He squeezed her hand once more, then released it. "Now let me sleep. I'm exhausted." "Sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." "I know you will." Evelyn sat beside him as he drifted back to sleep, his breathing deep and even now, his color improving. Grace woke and needed feeding, and Evelyn tended to her daughter while keeping watch over Caleb. The morning sun filled the house with golden light, and outside the ranch waited, fields to tend, cattle to manage, a life to build. It wouldn't be easy. Garrett and his men would still be a threat. Money would be tight. The town would still judge and whisper and make things difficult. But for the first time since that desperate crossroads under the burning sun, Evelyn felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind that shattered at the first setback, but the stubborn, resilient kind that survived because it was rooted in something real, in choices made and honored, in trust earned and given, in two broken people deciding to stand together instead of falling apart separately. Caleb slept through most of that day and into the night, his body healing, his strength slowly returning. Evelyn kept vigil, changing his dressings, forcing him to drink when he woke enough to swallow, monitoring every breath and heartbeat. And when dawn came again, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of fire and gold, Caleb woke truly clear-eyed and steady. He was weak still, would need weeks to fully recover, but he was alive. They both were. They'd survived the crossroads, the storm, the judgment, and the violence. Now came the harder part, learning to live instead of just survive. But they'd face it together, and somehow that made all the difference. The days following Caleb's injury settled into a different rhythm than before. Slower, more careful, but also somehow deeper. Evelyn took over the ranch work that Caleb couldn't manage, learning tasks she'd never imagined doing. She fed the chickens and gathered eggs, pumped water for the cattle, even tried her hand at milking the cow Caleb kept for household use. Her hands blistered and her back ached, but there was satisfaction in the work, in knowing she was keeping things running while Caleb healed. Caleb, for his part, chafed at being bedridden. He tried to get up too soon, insisted he was fine, and generally made a terrible patient until Evelyn threatened to tie him to the bed if he didn't stay put and let his body mend properly. After that, he settled into reluctant compliance, spending his days giving Evelyn instructions about the ranch and his nights staring at the ceiling, clearly frustrated by his own weakness. Grace thrived during those weeks, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. She began smiling, real smiles, not just gas, and the first time Evelyn saw her daughter smile at Caleb, something in her chest cracked open with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the seed from which love could grow. 2 weeks after the shooting, Evelyn was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw riders approaching. Her heart seized with immediate fear, but these weren't Garrett's men. There were 5 of them, and as they drew closer, she recognized a few faces from town, ranchers she'd never spoken to but had seen during her brief time in the territory. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to meet them, chin up, ready for whatever judgment they'd brought. Caleb was inside, still too weak to be much help if this turned ugly, and Grace was sleeping in her basket. Evelyn was on her own. The lead rider was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and weathered hands. He removed his hat as he reined in his horse. "Ma'am, I'm John Collins. I ranch about 15 miles east of here. These are my neighbors, Ben Walsh, Henry Cooper, Tom Chen, and David Morrison." Evelyn nodded warily. "What can I do for you, Mr. Collins?" "Well, we heard about what happened to Caleb. Heard Garrett's men ambushed him after he stood up for you and your little one." Collins shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. "We also heard he's laid up healing and probably can't manage all the work that needs doing before winter." "He's recovering. We're managing." "I'm sure you are, but we figured we'd come by and see if you needed any help. We've got some fence posts in the wagon back there, and Tom's brought wire. Ben's got tools. We thought we'd spend the day fixing up what needs fixing, if that's all right with you." Evelyn stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. "You want to help us?" "Yes, ma'am. We should have helped 4 years ago when Garrett went after Caleb and Sarah. We were cowards then, afraid of making waves, afraid of losing our own standing. We let a good man suffer because it was easier than standing up. Collins met her eyes. We won't make that mistake again. But Garrett's got power, but he doesn't own all of us. He's been throwing his weight around for too long, and some of us are tired of bending. Collins glanced at the other men, who nodded agreement. What he did to Caleb, having him shot in an alley like some kind of outlaw, that crossed a line. There's men in town now who are asking questions, and Garrett's finding out that fear only works when everyone's afraid together. Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just point us toward what needs doing, and we'll get to work. The door to the house opened and Caleb appeared, leaning heavily on the doorframe, his shirt loose over the bandages still wrapped around his torso. He looked at the assembled men, and something passed across his face. Surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been hope. John, he said, his voice still weak but steady. Didn't expect to see you here. Probably should have come sooner. Collins dismounted and walked toward the porch. How you healing? Slow but sure. Good. That's good. Collins looked back at his companions. We brought supplies and strong backs. Figure we can get your fence mended, that weak spot in the barn roof patched, maybe even fix those porch steps that have been rotting for the past 2 years. Caleb's jaw worked, and Evelyn could see him struggling with emotion. You don't have to do this. I know. We want to. Collins held out his hand. Let us help, Caleb. Let us do what we should have done 4 years ago. Caleb gripped the offered hand, and the two men stood there for a moment, an understanding passing between them that needed no words. Then Caleb nodded. All right, there's work enough for everyone. Evelyn can show you what's most urgent. The men set to work, and Evelyn found herself directing a small crew of experienced ranchers who treated her with a respect she'd never experienced before. They didn't ask intrusive questions about her past or make judgments about her situation. They just worked, and when they broke for lunch, they ate the simple food she prepared and thanked her like it was a feast. By the end of the day, the fence was mended, the barn roof was patched, the porch steps were replaced with solid new wood, and a dozen other small repairs had been completed. As the sun began setting, the men prepared to leave. Collins approached Evelyn, hat in hand. Ma'am, there's something you should know. Word's gotten around town about what you did. How you saved Caleb's life after he got shot. How you kept this place running while he healed. People are talking, but it's not the kind of talk Garrett wanted. What do you mean? They're saying you're a woman of character, that you've proven yourself, that maybe we all judged too quickly based on circumstances we didn't understand. He glanced toward the house where Caleb was resting. There's a women's group in town, the church ladies mostly. They're putting together supplies for you and the baby, clothes, blankets, things like that. They wanted me to ask if it would be all right to bring them by next week. Evelyn's throat tightened. The same women who wouldn't help me when I first came through town? Some of them, yes. They're ashamed of that now, wanting to make amends. Collins turned his hat in his hands. I know it doesn't erase what happened, but people can change if they're given the chance. We're all hoping you and Caleb will give us that chance. It's not my decision alone, but it's partly yours. And I'm asking, will you let us try to do better? Evelyn looked at this weathered rancher who'd swallowed his pride to ask forgiveness, at the other men loading tools into their wagon, at the ranch that had been transformed in a single day by the work of neighbors who'd chosen to stand together instead of apart. She thought about all the closed doors and cruel words, and then she thought about the possibility of opening doors and kind words. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, we'll give you the chance. Collins smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret it. After the men left, Evelyn found Caleb sitting on the newly repaired porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. She sat beside him, careful not to jar his still healing wound. Did you hear? She asked. Most of it. Collins has a voice that carries. Caleb was quiet for a moment. 4 years I've been alone out here, convinced the whole territory had turned against me. Turns out, I just needed to give them a reason to remember who they were supposed to be. You gave them that reason by standing up for me in grace. Maybe. Or maybe they just needed someone to be brave first so they could find their own courage. He looked at her. Either way, things are changing. Are you sorry that you stood up when it cost you so much? I got shot, Evelyn. That's not nothing. I know. But would you do it differently if you could go back? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. No, he finally said. I wouldn't change a thing. Because if I'd ridden past you at that crossroads, if I'd sent you away when Garrett demanded it, if I'd chosen safety over doing what's right, I'd have lost something worth more than this ranch or my standing or even my life. What? Myself. The man I'm supposed to be. He turned to look at her. You and Grace, you didn't just save my life after I got shot. You saved me from becoming someone I couldn't live with. Someone so afraid of being hurt again that I'd stopped being fully human. Evelyn felt tears slip down her cheeks. You saved us first. We saved each other. That's what people do when they choose to stand together. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared and stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Grace woke inside and began fussing, and Evelyn rose to tend to her. When she came back outside with the baby in her arms, Caleb was still sitting on the steps, looking out at his land. What are you thinking about? Evelyn asked. The future. What comes next? He glanced up at her. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, but I wanted to wait until I was thinking clearly and not delirious from blood loss. I remember you asked me to stay. That was part of it, but there's more. Caleb stood carefully, wincing slightly but steadier than he'd been in days. Evelyn Moore, I'm not a man who's good with flowery words or romantic gestures. I'm rough around the edges. I've got a past that still haunts me, and I'm stubborn enough to get myself shot defending principles most people think are foolish. I'm aware of all that. But I'm also a man who keeps his promises. A man who'll stand beside you when the world tries to push you down. A man who'll love Grace like she's my own daughter, because that's what she deserves. He paused, seeming to gather courage. I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not because you need my protection or because it's proper, but because these past few weeks have shown me what life can be when you share it with someone who makes you want to be better. Because I love you, Evelyn. I love your strength and your courage and the way you fight for what matters. And I want to spend whatever time I've got left building a life with you. Evelyn's breath caught. She'd known this was coming, had felt it building between them, but hearing the word still shocked her. Marriage. A real partnership, legal and binding and permanent. I don't come with much, she said quietly. A baby, a tattered reputation, and memories I'd rather forget. And I come with a half-failing ranch, enemies who want to destroy me, and the ghost of a wife I loved and lost. Caleb stepped closer. We're both damaged goods, Evelyn, but maybe damaged things can fit together in ways that whole things can't. Maybe we can build something stronger because we know what it's like to break. What about Grace? You'd really claim her as yours. I already have, in every way that matters. A piece of paper from the county just makes it official. He reached out and gently touched the baby's soft hair. She deserves a father who will love her and protect her, and teach her that she's worthy of good things, regardless of how she came into this world. I want to be that father, if you'll let me. Evelyn looked down at Grace, then up at Caleb. She thought about the crossroads where they'd met, when she'd been ready to die rather than keep walking. She thought about the storm that had sheltered them, the slow building of trust, the moment he'd chosen to defend her even when it cost him everything. She thought about watching him ride home wounded and bleeding, about the terror of thinking she might lose him, about the relief when he'd opened his eyes and smiled at her. She thought about all the closed doors and cruel judgments, and then she thought about this man who'd opened his home and his heart, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to do what was right. Yes, she said, and the word felt like coming home after a long journey. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll let you be Grace's father and my husband and my partner in everything that comes next. Caleb's face transformed with a smile that made him look 10 years younger. He pulled her close, carefully, mindful of his healing wound, and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and tasted of new beginnings, and Grace cooed between them as if blessing the union. When they pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against Evelyn's. We'll do this right, he said. Go into town together, file the papers, have a proper ceremony. Let everyone see that I'm choosing you freely and proudly, not hiding you away like something shameful. That's going to make waves. Good. Let them wave. We'll stand steady. The following week, Caleb and Evelyn rode into town together in the wagon. Caleb was still healing, but strong enough to sit upright, and Evelyn held Grace in her lap, dressed in a simple new gown she'd sewn from fabric Caleb had in storage. They went straight to the county office and filed the papers, Caleb's signature bold and sure beside Evelyn's more careful script. Then they went to the church. The minister was a young man, newer to the territory, who hadn't been there during Sarah's illness and Caleb's previous troubles. He listened to their story without judgment and agreed to marry them that very afternoon. Word spread quickly through town, and by the time the ceremony began, the small church was filled with people. Some came out of curiosity, some came because they genuinely wanted to support the couple, and some, like Collins and his fellow ranchers, came to show solidarity, to make a public statement that they stood with Caleb and Evelyn against anyone who might try to cause trouble. Thomas Garrett was notably absent, as were his closest allies. But their absence didn't diminish the occasion. If anything, it highlighted the shift that had occurred. The territory was choosing a different path, one based on compassion rather than judgment. Evelyn stood at the altar in a borrowed dress, provided by one of the church ladies who'd come to apologize, holding Grace in one arm while Caleb held her other hand. The minister spoke words about love and commitment and choosing to stand together through hardship. And when he asked if they would honor and cherish each other for as long as they both lived, they answered with voices strong and sure. "I will." "I do." The minister smiled. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Hartman, you may kiss your bride." Caleb did, with Grace pressed between them, and the small congregation erupted in applause and cheers. It wasn't the grandest wedding or the most elaborate ceremony, but it was real and honest and witnessed by people who'd chosen to celebrate rather than condemn. After the ceremony, the church ladies had prepared a simple reception, cake and coffee and sandwiches set out in the church hall. People congratulated the couple, admired Grace, and talked about ordinary things like weather and cattle prices and whose barn needed painting. It was gloriously, beautifully normal, and Evelyn found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn found herself standing near a window, watching Caleb talk with John Collins and some of the other ranchers. Grace was being passed around among a group of women who cooed over her and complimented Evelyn on what a beautiful, healthy baby she was. No one asked about Grace's father, no one made cutting remarks about propriety or morality. They just accepted her as Evelyn Hartman's daughter and Caleb's adopted child, a family complete and legitimate regardless of how it had formed. One of the church ladies approached Evelyn, an older woman with steel gray hair and kind eyes. "Mrs. Hartman, I wanted to apologize properly. When you came through town before, I was one of the women who turned you away. I told myself I was protecting my own reputation, but the truth is I was just being cruel. I'm sorry for that. Truly sorry." Evelyn studied the woman's face and saw genuine remorse there. "Why the change?" "My granddaughter. She's 15, and last month I found out she's expecting. The father's a drifter who left town the moment he heard, and I realized that if she comes to me for help, I want to be the kind of grandmother who opens her arms, not closes her door." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I want her to know she's loved, no matter what mistakes she makes. And I can't teach her that if I'm still judging you for the same situation." "What's your name?" Evelyn asked gently. Margaret Flynn." "Thank you, Margaret, for your apology and your honesty." Evelyn touched the older woman's arm. "When your granddaughter needs support, she's lucky she'll have you." "I hope so. I'm trying to be better." Margaret managed a watery smile. "And I hope you and Mr. Hartman will be happy. You both deserve it." As the reception wound down and people began heading home, Caleb and Evelyn collected Grace and climbed back into the wagon. They rode out of town as the sun set, painting the sky in those familiar shades of crimson and gold. Neither spoke much during the ride, both lost in their own thoughts, both processing the momentous change that had occurred. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped Evelyn down from the wagon, and they stood in the yard looking at the small house that was now legally theirs together, both their names on the deed, both their futures bound to this land and to each other. Home, Caleb said simply. Home, Evelyn echoed, and the word had never meant more. The months that followed were hard but good. Winter came with its usual Wyoming fury, bitter cold, deep snow, howling winds that rattled the windows and piled drifts against the barn. But the house was warm, the pantry was stocked with food they'd preserved together, and the cattle survived in the sheltered valleys where Caleb had driven them before the first serious snow. Garrett made one more attempt to cause trouble, spreading rumors that the marriage was a sham, that Evelyn had trapped Caleb into legitimizing her bastard child. But the rumors found no purchase in a community that had watched Caleb and Evelyn work side by side, had seen the genuine affection between them, had witnessed their quiet devotion to each other and to Grace. Eventually, Garrett gave up. His power had been based on fear, and when people stopped being afraid, his influence crumbled. By spring, he'd sold his ranch and moved to Montana, leaving behind a territory that was slowly learning to choose compassion over judgment. Grace grew through that first winter, hitting all the milestones that marked a healthy, thriving child. She learned to roll over, to sit up, to reach for things with increasing coordination. And the first word she spoke, clear and unmistakable one morning in February, was Papa, looking directly at Caleb with her bright, trusting eyes. Caleb had to leave the room for a moment after that, and when he came back, his eyes were red, but his smile was genuine. He picked up Grace and held her close, and Evelyn watched them together and felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it almost hurt. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and turning the brown landscape green. Wildflowers bloomed along the path to the house, purple lupine and yellow balsam root and delicate white prairie stars. Caleb planted a garden with Evelyn, teaching her which vegetables grew best in Wyoming's short growing season. Grace learned to crawl, exploring every corner of the house with determined curiosity. The ranch prospered. The cattle Caleb sold that spring brought enough money to pay down the bank loans and buy supplies for the coming year. New neighbors moved into the territory, good people who treated Caleb and Evelyn with respect and warmth. The community grew stronger, bound together by the knowledge that they'd chosen to support each other rather than tear each other down. One evening in early summer, Evelyn stood on the porch watching the sunset while Caleb sat in the rocking chair with Grace, now almost a year old, dozing in his lap. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of growing things, and in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully in the golden light. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. Evelyn turned to look at her husband and daughter, at this life they'd built from nothing but determination and hope. "I'm thinking about that crossroads. The one where you found me." "What about it?" "I was so certain that day that my life was over, that there was no path forward, no possibility of anything good. I thought the best I could hope for was a quick death instead of a slow one. And now? Now I'm standing on a porch I helped build, watching sunset over land I helped tend, married to a man I love and who loves me back. My daughter is healthy and happy and will grow up knowing she's wanted and valued." Evelyn's voice caught. "I have a home, Caleb, a real home. Not just a place to sleep, but a place I belong." Caleb stood carefully, Grace still sleeping against his shoulder, and moved to stand beside Evelyn. With his free arm, he pulled her close. "We both found home," he said quietly. "I was just as lost as you were, just wandering in a different way. You think you were the only one saved that day at the crossroads? Weren't I? No. We saved each other. You gave me a reason to fight again, to care again, to believe that good things were still possible. You reminded me what it meant to be fully human, instead of just going through the motions of living." He kissed the top of her head. "We found each other when we both needed finding. That's not luck. That's something more." They stood together on the porch as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Grace stirred, but didn't wake, secure in her father's arms. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song, and the wind carried the smell of sage and growing grass. This was home. Not the place they'd been born to or the life they'd expected, but the one they'd chosen and built together through courage and stubbornness and refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. A home earned through survival and strengthened through choice, through standing together when the world tried to push them apart, through believing that love and family could be defined by commitment rather than convention. The summer night deepened around them. Inside the house, lamps waited to be lit. Tomorrow would bring its own work and challenges and small victories. But tonight, they had this moment, this perfect, peaceful moment of being exactly where they belonged, with exactly the people they were meant to be with. Evelyn had walked hundreds of miles searching for this feeling. Caleb had spent 4 years thinking he'd never feel it again. And Grace, born into hardship and judgment, would grow up knowing it as her birthright. Home wasn't a place you were given. It was something you built, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. It was something you fought for and protected and nurtured until it became strong enough to shelter everyone within its walls. And this home, this rough ranch in Wyoming, this small family bound together by choice rather than blood, this life built from brokenness and healed through love, was strong enough to last. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The land stretched vast and endless in all directions. And on the porch of a small ranch house, 3 people who'd found each other at a crossroads stood together, looking toward a future that held no guarantees but was full of possibility. They'd survived the burning sun and the terrible storm. They'd faced judgment and violence and fear. They'd nearly lost everything, including each other, but they'd held on. They'd chosen courage over safety, compassion over convenience, love over fear, and in the end, that had made all the difference. This was where the road had led them, not to an ending, but to a beginning, not to rescue, but to partnership, not to escape from their past, but to the courage to build futures worth having. Home, family, belonging. They'd found it not by running away, but by standing still and fighting for what mattered, and that was the greatest victory of all.